For this third and final part of this week's lecture, I want to go through the idea of a student login and then being able to list students in a table within a view. So one of these things will comply with our use case scenario, and one of these is just kind of an introduction to a concept of being able to pull and pass data in and out of your application. So we'll jump back into our quote-unquote week 4 MVC application, and we'll start using this app in implementing the login. So when we last finished, we actually implemented a dependency injection component, and that dependency injection allowed us to decouple our student repository class from the iStudent repository interface. So we could now just create an instance of iStudent repository called repo, and then we would tell the repository engine to go in and actually find for us a class that implements iStudent repository. We also talked briefly about the project or library that's available to you through NuGet called Ninject. A lot more information is available within the textbook around this concept or around this framework, and I'd recommend looking at it as well for a more robust and rich framework. But in the last lecture, we just wanted to kind of dig a layer deeper under the covers and understand what do these dependency injection and inversion of control or IOC containers do for us. So to do login, we have an action and we have a view. Now the view is empty. It's bound to the student model, and this is old code that we had from previous lecture. I'm going to go ahead and drop it. And what I want to start out by doing is just returning the login page to the user. So when the user hits student/login, they should just get the login box with the username and password and the submit fields. So from our empty login page, what we want to do is we actually want to build the authentication or submission form for our login. Now to do that, we're going to start off by actually declaring or defining an HTML form. Now traditionally, when you took your HTML course, you would do things like form form action equals, and then you would put in the name of a page that you wanted your form to submit to. And then inside of here you would do things like input type text, and then you put name, email address, let's say, and then you'd probably put a label up here and just say that this is the email address, and then you do a BR tag, same thing for password, input type equals password, and the name is password. And then finally you do input type submit. And that would give you your basic authentication form. Well, the process that we're going to use is similar, but it's slightly different. We're going to use our razor notation instead, and we have some special helper methods that are available to us to help us build this same form. So to start off, we're going to use our @ symbol, and we're going to use a using statement. And in this using statement, we're going to say html.begin form. And inside of the begin form, we're going to insert our text box for our email address and text box for our password, and then a submit button. There are HTML helpers for this as well, so we can say html.textbox4. And then inside of here, we're going to use one of these lambda expressions, and we're going to say m for model. So m.email address, and then a break tag. We'll actually do it this, put the @ sign in front of that. And then we can do another @HTML, and we can say password for m.password, BR tag, and then we'll say input type submit, and that will give us our submit tag. So if we save this and we do a refresh and a reload, we'll end up with this type of a form. Now we need a couple of labels here to identify this is username and this is email address and this is password. So to do that, we're going to use an additional notation. We'll say HTML dot label for m dot email address colon, and we'll use the same thing and change this to password. So by saying label for and then text box for, the Razor engine will actually determine that we want a label for the email address field, and then that we want a text box for the email address field and a password for the email address field. There we go. So now we have email address and password. So from here we can now input our email address and our password. Now just to make this functional, let's go back into our database real fast and we'll say show table data, and we'll need to give ourselves an email address and password. So we'll do ucmail.uc.edu and we'll just do a basic password of password. Now obviously this isn't the right way to do things. You wouldn't want clear text passwords, but for demonstration purposes we won't get into the idea of password encryption. So we now have a username and a password. And when we put in our email address and our password, we hit submit. And I'm going to peek behind the scenes for a moment using my element inspector, and I want to look at where the form is going to be submitting to, because if you remember we didn't actually define anywhere, we just said HTML begin form. So where exactly is our form going? Our form is actually going back to student/login. It's doing a post. MVC allows you the capability of handling posts versus GET submissions in the same controller using the same action name. Now the parameters have to be different and you have to define which method you're wanting to handle, but you can actually handle this call back to student/login as a post method, capturing both the email address and the password. So to do this, what we're going to have to do here is let's actually stop our program for a moment and let's jump back into our controller. Now within our controller we can say this is going to be for HTTP post. We're going to define another method with an action result, and we're going to call it login. And it's going to take two parameters. It's going to take email address and password. And inside of here we're going to do the authentication. We're going to say repo get all students where s for student dot email address equals email address, and then we'll grab first or default. So then this will be our var student, and then we'll say if student equals null, then we're going to go back to the view again, and maybe we pass in to the view bag an error message. Invalid username or password. If we have a student, then we'll say if student.password equals password, successful login. Else, we'll return the same message again. So let's go ahead and recompile, clean up our errors. And what we'll do here is we'll just do a return content good login. And we'll jump back to our application and we will hit submit. Actually, as we do that, I'm going to add a breakpoint, re-enable my debugging, sorry, we're going to have to stop and restart. So we'll break and debug. We'll navigate back to student/login. And we'll log in. Password of password. We have our breakpoint set. And we'll hit submit. And what has happened now is because this was a post to student/login, we did not navigate to the first method for login. We navigated into the second one. And MVC has a feature called model binding. So it went ahead and it looked at all of the data coming from the form submission, and it started to try to match up names to our parameters. So it found the text box submission for email address and matched it up to our email address parameter and passed it in there. Same thing with the password. It passed our string text password into the password parameter because it came from a text box called password. So from there we can do our authentication. We got a student, so our email address doesn't match. Check our password. Successful login, and we should get a response back on the page that says good login. If we go back, however, and we put in a bad password, and we hit submit, we'll do the same authentication again. We still have a student because the email address is valid, but now we have a bad password. So we'll go ahead and hit continue, and we get returned back to the login page, but our error message didn't show. That's okay, that's a simple fix. We'll jump back into our view. You can put a logic statement and say if viewbag.error does not equal null, and we say raw, and then we can just have that simply be equal to viewbag.error. So if we refresh again, and we'll say continue, the Razor parser does not like that. It was the nested HTML. So we've got that saved. We will refresh again. And there's our error message, invalid username and password. A little bit more formatting just to help clean things up. And we should be in pretty good shape. Now, something else that we could do is we could say html.label. And then we get some more control over things like styling. So label takes a string as the expression, which would be our viewbag error. And then we have these HTML attributes that we can also include. So we can say comma new. I'm going to say style equals color colon red. And what this is basically saying is take that label and add a style element to it and make the color be red. So we'll go ahead and refresh. And we've got some additional Razor parser issues. And because of the Razor parsing issue, I'm going to go ahead and take a different approach. Sometimes you'll find this, that Razor, while it's very powerful and it's very good at parsing, sometimes you end up with a lot of mixed case syntax, and sometimes it's actually better to break out of some C# code every once in a while and go back to using standard HTML. So in this case, I'm going to say color red, font weight, colon, bold. And then inside of here, I'm just going to simply say viewbag.error. So by putting inside this if statement, this HTML, this is a completely valid way of doing markup. And then by just simply saying at viewbag.error, it'll take this value and inject it into our page. So let's go ahead and reload the login page. We'll log in again, and we'll do a test password, and we'll just let that run, and we get invalid username and password. If we just type in password, which is the default password, we allow that to run, we get good login. So that's the basic idea of pushing and pulling data back and forth from your MVC application. After that, what we can also do is we can then redirect to another view, and in that view we can push a collection of all students. This is not part of the use case scenario, but I just want to show that demonstration of redirecting to another view and then being able to push data to it. So instead of creating an action and then a view, I'm going to right click on my views folder directly and choose add view, and I'm going to call this my student list. And I'm going to go ahead and instead of saying that it's empty, I want to use the template for list, and I'm going to bind that to the student model. And these templates are nice for basic CRUD or create, edit, remove, update and delete screens and lists. And these templates basically give you some predetermined formatting, and when you set it with a binding model class, then you don't have to worry about doing a whole lot of work. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and you'll notice here that this basically has stubbed out a pretty decent amount of HTML for us. It's even said that it wants an IEnumerable of student, or a collection of students, and it created this entire markup with a table for student list. It pulled every property from the student object and made them available, and it even included the edit details and delete buttons so that you could actually edit, view the details, or delete any one of the students. So it's a pretty nice starting point when you're trying to build a lot of these CRUD screens. So I'm going to call student list. So instead of saying return content, I'm going to say view. And inside of here I have a lot of different overloads. One of them is for the iView, one's for object model, and one is for the view name. So I'm going to call student list, and then I'm going to pass into it repo.getAllStudents. Now again, this isn't what you would normally do with a login, but I'm just showing you the idea of redirecting to another page after a successful login. So we'll go ahead and we'll hit F5. And we need to go to student/login. And then we'll put in our credentials and submit. Now what has happened is the Razor engine is looping through attempting to find a file with the name student list. And you'll notice that it's looking in all of these different places. It's looking under views, student, student list, views, student, student list, ASCX, and it looks for it in different combinations with CSHTML and VBHTML, trying to find it. Now, the reason it can't find it is that we dropped our view file into the root of views. Where it needs to actually live is underneath the student folder. This student folder, by naming convention, aligns with the student controller. And because the call is coming from the student controller for student list, the name of the view is student list coming from the student controller, we need to make sure that our student list view file lives underneath the student folder under views. It's a very small detail, but it's very important that if you don't ensure that your view files are underneath the right folder, then when it gets called by a controller, it may not actually get found, because the MVC framework is doing a lot of work trying to identify, bind, and then create files and screens and pages based off of these conventions. So by moving that file, no recompile necessary, I'm just going to refresh. Running IIS Express, whenever the compiler stops or the debugger stops, you have to restart. Otherwise, you lose access to your web page. So we're going to go back to login. Then we're going to log in. And here's a list of all of our students. So I hope this series of lectures this week has helped you to get a better sense of how to pull data from the database, incorporate it into your application, the ideas of dependency injection, and negotiating data from forms being submitted to and from your application. These basic mechanics will help you build all of your MVC applications with some modifications and adjustments, and just getting a better grasp of concepts throughout the development of the MVC process. Thanks.